investigative group at Positive Technologies.
Привет, лужники! Ну что, вы готовы к этим?
Hello, Luzhniki. Are you ready for these 4 very packed days of our program?
Не все еще проснулись. Ну что ж, наш...
I believe not everybody is awake, but our track starts with cybersecurity. Where do we start? And I think everything starts with the preparation. When we are talking about readiness to counteract cyber attacks, I think a lot of attention should be put to what companies actually do to define this readiness, to make the processes, to streamline the interaction inside the team. That's why I want to give the floor to Fedor, to my colleague, who will tell you how we figured out different difficulties in the market and how companies cope with it. Hello, everyone. I would like to tell you what kind of problems Russian organizations face when counteracting cyber attacks. The reason for that is that there is an increased activity of cyber criminals in the recent years, and because of the analytics on pen tests. We had very interesting numbers, and we decided to dig a little bit and see what kind of situation we have at the Russian market.
Там крутится, поэтому...
Да, прошу прощения. Перед тем, как перейти
Before we start,
нашего исследования, я бы хотел рассказать о том, как оно вообще...
I would like to share a few words on how we actually had the whole process. Our study is based on a survey which we had in the beginning of this year. Our target audience was specialists in IT and cybersecurity. We had more than 650 people who took part in the survey from more than 60 Russian companies. And in fact, we could have had more companies because it was an anonymous report and they may or may not took part in it. We also had customers take part in this survey. So what was the components of this readiness to counteract cyber attacks? First of all, it's assessment of readiness, and then building and maintaining this cybersecurity. First, we build the cybersecurity, and then we monitor the events which happen in the infrastructure. Now, let us move to the specific methodology used by Russian organizations to assess their readiness to withstand cyber attacks. Our conclusion was that only 28% of companies use objectively reasonable methods to protect, like pen tests or cyber range or deploying programs for bug bounty. Those methods are objectively good, and the reason is that they copy, I wouldn't even say just copy, they are real activities of real malicious users. Those people just get into your infrastructure and they actually attack your infrastructure like it happens in real life. Not only those events should be carried out regularly, it should be quite often. Our conclusion was that 21% of organizations have pen tests only once a year or on demand, which is actually a rare occasion because infrastructure changes. There is a scaling of its structure, there are different changes, there are new assets, and this does not give an objective, comprehensive assessment of cyber protection. I would even add that between the two instances of checks, you lose the control. Okay, you have the first report, and then you have the second report. You understand what you need to do right here, right now, but it might be a whole year before you have the next pen test, and you have no idea what's going on during this year. That's a very valid point, Anton. And now let's move to the metrics. How do we assess the readiness for cyber attacks.
Перечисленные мной ранее методы
All the enumerated
защищенности,
methods and analysis of cyber protection, they are more in the sense of expert assessment. It's high level, mid level, low level of cyber protection. So what do we have? Well, basically nothing. We do not have an objective understanding if this infrastructure is protected or not. And one of the more useful metrics to assess the efficiency, or rather readiness, is to have specific metrics. And only 4% of Russian organizations use these metrics. And of those 4%, only 39 try to implement temporal metrics in their assessment. I think the most objective metrics are TTA, time to attack, and another important metric is TTR, time to response. And this ratio between TTA and TTR defines the readiness of organizations to withstand cyber attacks. When we're talking about metrics, I think we more or less covered it. Now let's move to the processes. What processes are used by the organizations to maintain their infrastructure protection? Usually it's vulnerability management, compliance for network infrastructure, obviously the network itself, and user configuration. As a result, 80% of organizations do not have comprehensive work to improve their infrastructure. What I mean is that they do not, only 20% of companies work on all the processes at the same time. It's very important to work with assets. If we do not know what our infrastructure is about, what can we actually strengthen when we have no idea what we have, where we have it? That's the reason why asset management is very important. And 52% of organizations implement and maintain without asset management, and that's really bad. Maybe we should add a few points why we should care about processes, because malicious users don't really care if we had enough time, if we didn't have enough time, if you patch us vulnerabilities or segment the network, they will find this backdoor to get inside and fulfill their goal. So 80% who do not use all the processes, they have this potential. They have this potential to allow this more robust cyber protection. I hear you, but here's a different problem. When we're talking about assessment and prioritization of these processes, it's based on a risk assessment of different assets. It should be noted that there are different ways to implement for business risks. Obviously, we should take into account business risks, and not everybody is paying attention to them either. We also had a different survey, what kind of difficulties they face when strengthening their infrastructure. The main pain points, the main bottleneck is the lack of competence and time. And the reason being, that's the reason. If they do not have asset management, they do not know how to range the priorities. So obviously there are some difficulties here. Lack of time and lack of competence significantly impacts the level of cyber protection and readiness to counteract and withstand those cyber attacks. The process of improving cybersecurity is somewhere between IT and cybersecurity. About 30% said that they have difficulties with interaction between different departments for IT and cybersecurity. SLA is a good practice. It's basically a specific document which defines what kind of work will be done, when we would be done. And about 70% of organizations have problems with implementing those with implementing new solutions, and that's why SOA doesn't work there very well, but it is a solution. So we've covered the hardening of infrastructures. Now let's move to the monitoring aspect. How do they treat it? There are three main aspects of monitoring. First is data input from assets. Second is regularity of this data input and completeness of gathered data. 39% of organizations control the fact that data that they received data, that they do not have information about the completeness of their data. So they know that something got there, but they have no idea what kind of data they have. It's very important to have this information to decrease the TTR, time to response. I would even add a specific example. Suppose we have an operating system, Windows, and we have an account, they have journal, application system, and if you want to see the actions of a hacker, you will work with sysmon policies to have the extended launches of different processes, working with sockets, and if a malicious user would get into this machine and deactivate sysmon, then at the basic level, you will see that yes, you have new events, you can see events from these hosts, but it's important that you do not see them completely, you don't understand what's actually going on there. To understand that there is a very important part, what's missing, it's very important for you to notice a hacker if for some reason they get into infrastructure and start moving around. That's a very good point, Anton, thank you. If we sum it up, what kind of problems do Russian organizations have when they work with different cyber attacks? First of all, it's not enough pen tests, cyber range, working with white hackers. Next is low assessment of cyber attacks withstanding. We should do it more often. And finally, selective improvement of specific nodes. It's also very important. And finally, the lack of constant monitoring. It is very important. And I would like to give the floor to Anton, who will help us solve all those problems. Actually, yes, it's very important to take a look at these problems. How can we solve them? Through understanding the processes, different solutions which can be implemented, and interaction of people in the company. So let's take a look how we actually assess this ability to withstand cyber attacks. As Fedor mentioned, it all starts with asset management. When you make a list of your hosts and users, you collect configuration from different hosts, you understand what kind of users are there, what kind of software, hardware you use. That's the nucleus, that's the core of what you need to know about your infrastructure. The next layer consists of two components. First is improving the infrastructure. This is what Fedor just was talking about. During this process, we believe that there is risk management or vulnerability management when you understand where a hacker could potentially get into your infrastructure to escalate privileges, to maybe move forward. That's the process to understand that. For example, here we do not have an encryption, and here it's a very simple network, and a hacker will be able to get inside here and move around our network. And finally, it's working with the users and their privileges. If you do not control that some kind of segment of testers have access to accounting, probably you lose an angle of attack. Somebody from testers might get into the wrong segment and implement a vulnerability. With hardening, we make this process very, very difficult. But there is a second component, is the monitoring of response. We must be ready and one must be sure that if a hacker gets into the infrastructure and starts to move around, we have to have enough time to respond to their actions. Here we have main actions, what we can do. Obviously, we can have more, but this is the basic set for the InfoSec team. Hardening is mainly about IT. If they need to work with vulnerabilities, if they need to work with users, if they need to segment network, in all these cases, InfoSec people go to IT people. All of that is based on SOA, all that is based on different agreements. This is what Fedor mentioned before. And this should work, but there is some difficulty. And the difficulty is that in each of these processes, there will be a lot of mismatches and a lot of recommendations what should be done. Everyone who faced different vulnerability problems, you've seen these reports with hundreds and thousands of pages and vulnerabilities. The same applies to host compliance and account appliance. And with all this documentation, it's not really clear what to prioritize, what do we do first and what do we do next. And when we're talking about response monitoring, a company should understand if they actually can see everyone. Maybe there is a certain segment which is not in the CM, maybe they do not have an EDR agents. They need to find the blind spots and vulnerabilities which would disallow hackers to get into the network. And for all this process to start working, we need to understand how hackers can move around in your infrastructure. Suppose we have CyberRange and pen tests, and you have an independent team, third-party team, and tried to pen test your company to get to some vulnerability, and then they present your report. And at that point, both IT people and InfoSec people understand what kind of vulnerabilities you need to remove, what you actually have to do, because you have a very, very specific report. But obviously, before the next pen test, before the next third-party support, you change your infrastructure, so everything changes. That is why pen tests are very important. You can have these priorities, but obviously you want to have this regularly so that you can have new, fresh reports to understand what you should prioritize and what you should pay more attention to. And here's where SLA starts to work properly, because IT people and InfoSec people clearly can see that these are the recommendations to follow, because they directly affect the abilities of hackers to reach core systems. And if they do so, they can prevent the access of a hacker. And now we have to measure, we have to know how do we monitor this. Only 4% of companies work with these metrics, and we want to make it more universal. Everything connected with hardening, we can measure with the time a hacker needs to reach their goal. Basically, it's time to attack. We can calculate it in Excel. This is what we do in our company. This is what some of our customers do. You basically understand how many steps a potential angle of attack would take. You suppose that this could be from a vulnerability exploitation. In some cases, it would be infrastructure errors or mistakes, and you have a basic understanding of how much time it would take. And with that, you get a design of an angle attack, how much time it would take. And when we're talking about time to response, obviously, sure, we have TDD and TDR. For information security, first of all, we have to monitor, we have to find the hacker, then it will take some time when we work with different correlation time. Basically 5 minutes is enough a CM to find a malicious user at this host, for example. And the same applies to time to response. If we know that EDR endpoint is installed on a host, if they have the correct policies, then a malicious user would try to inject some kind of code in their process. They won't be able to do so because ADR will be able to intercept it in a minute and restore the original process, thus preventing the attack. And it seems that in this paradigm, this system would work. But as I mentioned, the market lacks some kind of mechanism, some kind of instrument, some kind of tool to make this process automatic. And if we're talking about different properties of a solution that would assess the readiness of the infrastructure and an ability of the infrastructure to withstand the attack, obviously this is what we have on the screen. First of all, this solution should automatically find hackers in the infrastructure. They should look for potential vulnerabilities, for methods, for the ways hosts are connected via the network. Everything to understand what hackers would do once they get to your infrastructure. Once you have this map, this solution must be able to assess this according to the time to attack and time to response. Basically, this solution has to get inside your processes of protection and using them evaluate those activities. So once you have the routes, once you have the time, you basically can analyze how many tracks, how many routes are there where you cannot respond to the hacker. What are the routes where TTA is more or greater than TTR. And those solutions should provide you some very specific recommendations. It should focus your activities on what should be done right here, right now, so that IT people and InfoSec people would hear and would actually see what they need to do right here, right now. This will be the same as with pen test reports. Those people would actually understand why they need to do those things immediately. And the reason for that is that we need to befriend those two departments, IT people and InfoSec people, and working within the time frame which are comfortable, and obviously not working with all the vulnerabilities, but actually focusing on what needs to be done right here, right now. That's all we wanted to say. Thank you for your attention. We will be here at Luzhniki, and if you have any questions, please come.